found in the cannabis plant.
Next, we've got, thank you, Doctor.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairman Steele and members of the committee. My name is Steve Dillon. I'm a criminal defense attorney. I was raised in Lafayette. I was a teenage page in this building from my Uncle Bo, Republican from Lafayette. I've probably done more marijuana cases as a criminal defense attorney than anybody else in the state of Indiana. I've done literally thousands of cases. I graduated from Purdue University cum laude, and I graduated from IU. I can root both ways. From IU to Indianapolis, got my law degree, and I live in southern Indiana. I practice in 88 of the 92 counties, and again, a big part of my practice, and I'm willing to put myself out of business for marijuana cases if you legalize marijuana. I want to tell you a few things. There is a written testimony that you probably have that's in the green packet. If not, it's in this right here. And it's written by Paul Armentano of NORML. He's the deputy director. And he addresses some of the issues you've raised here. He talks about the receptor sites, the CB1 receptor sites in the brain and the CB2 receptor sites that allow all humans to process marijuana. It's one of these natural compounds that our bodies are built for receiving. It's a natural drug. I'm not going to go through this white paper, but it's a really good paper by Paul Armentano. It's his written testimony regarding marijuana regulation before the Indiana Criminal Law and Sentencing Policy Study Committee. I started studying marijuana when I was in law school. I worked for David Allison, who's a Republican representative here in Indianapolis. I went to my first NORML meeting. I founded Indiana NORML in 1974 with some other lawyers in Indianapolis. I've been involved with NORML since then. I'm chairman of the board nationally of NORML and have been for over a dozen years anyway. This paper from Paul Armentano talks about the history back to 9,000 years of medical marijuana use. It points out the 7,000 studies. It's the most studied plant in history. It talks about how we process marijuana. It talks about how marijuana is much safer than alcohol use in that comparison. It talks about marijuana's impact on the brain and driving performance. It talks about if we regulate marijuana, it will promote public safety. And it talks about what would happen if we decriminalize or legalize marijuana. There's a good portion of this that points out, and again, these are well documented in this paper, decriminalization has virtually no effect on marijuana use or related attitudes or belief about marijuana use among American young people. The states that have decriminalized, actually, I think they have less usage, not the same usage, and I'll address that in a little bit. Well, here it is in this paper. The federal statistics between 2003 and 2008 among 12 to 17-year-olds dropped precipitously in every state that has enacted medical marijuana legislation. In 5 states with medical marijuana laws, Alaska, Montana, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, and Washington, reported use fell by more than 20% during this period. In Hawaii, youth pot use fell by more than 30%. So I disagree with Dr. Gitman. I think that the recent statistics show actually a decrease in drug use among young people in states that have decriminalized or legalized marijuana. But I'm here to talk to you primarily about 2 things, and one is also in this paper, and hopefully you have it in the green packet. If not, it's in this folder, at least for 9 people. And that's marijuana is not a gateway drug. There's no valid scientific study proving that the use of marijuana leads to use. There's 9 separate packets in there, to more serious drugs. Marijuana is not a gateway drug as shown by the following valid scientific studies, and there's 17,000 studies. I just picked out a handful of the most commonly accepted scientific studies in this area, and I go back to 1988. Dr. Gitman talked about rescheduling marijuana from Schedule 1. Schedule 1 in the Controlled Substance Act said there's no accepted medical use and treatment in the United States for using marijuana. Of course, that's bogus when half the country now has medical marijuana. The other standard for inclusion in Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substance Act, like heroin and is in, or LSD is the no accepted medical use and treatment, and that's also been disproven. So I believe it is not properly scheduled, and that's what the administrative law judge, DEA's own administrative law judge, Francis Young, concluded after, I think, 15 years, from 1973 to 1988. They studied this issue nationally, and the DEA's judges said that marijuana is one of the safest therapeutically active substances known to man. Now, that's the DEA judge's study after 15 years. Dr. Zimmer, Ph.D., and John Morgan from New York University wrote a book called Marijuana Myths and Marijuana Facts in 1997. He reported that at that time there were 72 million Americans that had tried marijuana. It's now well over 100 million Americans. But much fewer Americans had tried cocaine or hard drugs. For every 100 people who've tried marijuana, only 28 even tried cocaine, and only 1 used cocaine weekly. The general statistics are still true. For 102 marijuana users, 1 person gets involved with cocaine. It's certainly not a stepping stone theory or gateway theory. Marijuana, I quote in this article, marijuana is the most popular legal drug in the United States today. Therefore, people who have used less popular drugs such as heroin, cocaine, or LSD are more likely to have also used marijuana. Most marijuanas never use any other illegal drug, and indeed, for a large majority of people, marijuana is a terminus or ending rather than a gateway drug. That was the doctor's conclusion in their book in '97. The National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine issued a report called Marijuana and Medicine, Assessing the Scientific Base in '99, and they concluded, quote, that there's no evidence that the drug effects of marijuana are causally linked to the subsequent use of other illicit drugs, end quote. Furthermore, it stated that marijuana is not a gateway drug to the extent that it is a cause or even the most significant predictor of serious drug use. That's the National Academy of Sciences. The American Journal of Public Health by Dr. Golub of the National Development and Research Institute in 2001 reported that, quote, a careful analysis of all the data suggests that the gateway phenomena that characterized drug subculture of the baby boomers doesn't apply in the same manner to the generation that starting to use marijuana in the mid-'90s. More importantly, all indications that the rate of progression to harder drugs may be continuing to decline even today. In 2002, Canada did a study called Cannabis, Our Position for Canadian Public Policy, and they reported cannabis itself is not a cause of other drug use. In 2006, the American Journal of Psychiatry reported a study at the University of Pittsburgh School of Pharmacy that found that adolescent marijuana use was not a reliable predictor of later substance use. Researchers found that adolescents who used marijuana prior to using other drugs, including alcohol and tobacco, were no more likely to develop a substance abuse disorder than other subjects in the study. The study, quote, calls into question the long-held belief that has shaped prevention efforts and governmental policy for 6 decades, end quote. Investigators found that environmental factors, such as greater exposure to illegal drugs in the neighborhood, as well as subjects' proneness to deviancy, were the 2 characteristics that most commonly predicted substance abuse. They concluded, quote, the emphasis on drugs themselves rather than the more important factors that shape a person's behavior has been detrimental to drug policy and prevention programs, end quote. The book Marijuana Safer by Steve Fox, Paul Armentano, and Mason Vert in 2009 addressed the myth that marijuana is a gateway drug as claimed by Karen Tandy, the DEA administrator from 2005 to 2007. Ms. Tandy said, and this is where somebody might get the bad statistics or quotes, she said, marijuana is a gateway drug. In law enforcement, rarely do we meet heroin or cocaine addicts who didn't start their drug use with marijuana, end quote. But the fact is, quote, in this book study, the overwhelming majority of American marijuana users never tried another illicit substance. Ms. Tandy neglects to mention that virtually everyone who's ever used cannabis tried alcohol or tobacco first. According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, only 3.5% of U.S. citizens have ever tried crack, and fewer than 2% have ever tried heroin, and less than 15% of Americans have tried cocaine. And that's with 40 million Americans that have tried marijuana. The Journal of Health and Social Behavior reported a study last year at the University of New Hampshire, 2010. They found the factors most likely to be associated with the subject's progression to hard drug use were age, stress, and whether or not they're employed following high school. According to lead investigator Karen Van Gundy, quote, it really didn't matter if someone used marijuana or not as a teen, end quote. She also implied that criminalizing marijuana users could inadvertently drive individuals toward more serious illicit drug use. She said, quote, if we overly criminalize behaviors like marijuana use among teens, this could interfere with opportunities for education and employment later on, which in turn creates more drug use. It's the prohibition that causes more serious drug use. In the article Closing the Gateway to Drug Abuse with Cannabis, 2010 by Paul Armentano, it states, quote, for decades, opponents of marijuana reform policies have falsely argued that marijuana is a gateway to drug abuse, a guilt by association charge that implies that because tens of millions of people have tried cannabis and a minority of those tens of millions have also tried other drugs, that somehow it must have been the pot that triggered the hard drug use. But while reformers have been consistent and accurate to point out that so-called gateway theory lacks any statistical support, for example, the U.S. government contends that more than 4 in 10 Americans have tried cannabis, yet fewer than 2% have ever tried heroin. Few in our movement have publicized the fact, and for many people, cannabis can be a powerful exit drug for those looking to curb or cease their use of alcohol, opiates, and narcotics. The author cites the Harm Reduction Journal with the 2010 study that found that cannabis using adults enrolled in substance abuse treatment programs fared equal or better than non-users in various outcome categories, including treatment completion. In other words, marijuana ends serious drug use rather than causes it. He also refers to a 2009 study in the American Journal on Addictions reporting that moderate cannabis use improved retention and naltrexone treatment among opiate-dependent subjects in New York State inpatient detoxification programs. He refers to a final additional study in the Journal of Neuropsychopharmacology, 2009, demonstrating, quote, that oral THC suppressed sensitivity to opiate dependence and conditioning. On this issue, as Dr. John Morgan stated, in the United States, the claim that marijuana acts as a gateway for the use of other drugs is mainly a rhetorical tool for frightening Americans into believing that winning the war against heroin and cocaine requires waging a battle against the casual use of marijuana. Not only is the claim intellectually indefensible, but it's a waste of resources and fated to failure. I've attached an attachment with more statistics about the research and Ms. Tandy's statement about the myth that using marijuana leads one to use harder drugs. Another thing I want to talk about is I got a call in 2001, 10 years ago, from a lady named Jeannie Horton here in Indianapolis. She was a 34-year-old disabled woman. She called me for help because she got busted with 2 grams of marijuana in a glass pipe next to her hospital bed in her apartment here in Indianapolis. She told me she didn't even have the $50 minimum public defender reimbursement fee, and I agreed to help her for free. Jean was divorced and had 2 kids in a modest subsidized apartment on the west side of Indianapolis. She had multiple sclerosis for 14 years. She couldn't walk or use most of her muscles for 9 years, and she was in a special hospital bed with air in it for her to cue by her bed sores. In April of 2001, an undercover officer at Jean's apartment had talked to her son about something that he might have witnessed about some other kid doing something at his high school out on the west side of Indianapolis. The kids were, her son and another kid were smoking marijuana in a bong in the front room and waiting for another kid to show up, and it was the policeman, didn't know it, knocked on the door. They said, come on in. The policeman came on in, arrested them for smoking a little marijuana in the bong, and asked where their mother was. They said, oh, my mother's in the back in a bed, don't bother her. But he went to the back. She admitted that the little bit of pot in the pipe next to her hospital bed was used with her doctor's knowledge that it was helping save her life. She's the only way she could gain 20 pounds, which kept her from dying or wasting from her wasting syndrome as part of her advanced MS. She reported pain relief and depression relief. She tried to tell them that the doctor said it was okay, but she was charged with both criminal offenses in Indianapolis. Now, I took this case, but I never dreamed the state of Indiana would continue to prosecute this poor woman for her 2 grams of marijuana. I mean, what are they going to do with a woman in a hospital bed facing a year in jail for the pipe and a year in jail and a $5,000 fine for the little bit of marijuana that's saving her life? How could they justify that? But, you know, the first time I kept the court in Court 10 in Indianapolis from requiring her to be there, I showed up and finally said she's got to show up. We got volunteers, and we carried this woman into the courtroom. She couldn't hold her head up because she had no muscles. So I'm here holding her head up in front of the judge, and tears are streaming down her face because she doesn't get out of bed except once a year to get a medical, or twice a year with an ambulance from the government to go get a medical checkup for her government subsidized medical treatment. I held her head up in front of the judge and the prosecutor. I said, surely you're going to dismiss this case. This would be a case for discretion. The prosecutor laughed at me. It zinged me right to the heart. I said, oh, my goodness. I demanded a jury trial. And I did demand a jury trial. I couldn't believe it. We had several hearings. I finally had 3 different judges in Municipal Court 10 in Indianapolis. Finally, I was allowed to present a necessity defense to the jury because of a letter from Dr. Farlow here in Indianapolis in September of 2001, that explained that he didn't prescribe it, but knew that she was using it and it had saved her life. She was literally dying and wasting away. Regular medicine couldn't take care of the depression, the pain, and the wasting syndrome. She gained 20 pounds by smoking pot. I think her son must have told her about it. So I finally established a medical necessity defense, which is another way to look at this. You can have laws on the books, but if you have a sentence in there that says if you're taking this marijuana under the control or recommendation or supervision of a doctor in the course of his practice, it's a defense to this charge. Well, anyway, I think maybe years ago it was in our state statutes like that. Dr. Farlow wrote his letter. I got my trials scheduled. I got Dr. David Bierman, who's a medical marijuana expert and physician from Santa Barbara, California, to come and testify at her trial. The court called me Friday to confirm, are you sure you're ready for jury trial Monday, Steve? And I said, yes, Judge, I'm ready, or to the clerk that called me. When we got there Monday, the judge said, you know, we can't have the trial today. We can't get 6 jurors out of the jury pool. Well, I've been in the jury pool. There's 200 people down in that assembly room in the city-county building, and they divide them up in groups of 30 or something and send them out to different courts. And I said, you know, Judge, I'll take the first 6. I don't need voir dire. I only need 6 people. I got to have my trial. And I said, nah. And they even put the judge of the jury pool under oath and let me question him about why I couldn't try to get 6 people out of 200 or 300 to be on this jury, but they called off my trial. And then I lost my doctor from California, but I took his deposition, and I do have a verified affidavit in the deposition available if you want to see it. Anyway, they rescheduled the jury trial weeks later. In the meantime, the Star and Channel 8 did a poll of the citizens of Indianapolis about what to do with this case. It was fairly public. She was interviewed, I was interviewed, the prosecutor was interviewed. And they found 80% of the people in Indianapolis said, leave this woman alone. If it's saving her life and the doctor's supervising her, why do we want to prosecute this woman? That's interesting. The same about statistic I heard from Dr. Getman, 81%. Some of the same statistics of all these medical marijuana states, they passed by about 80-some percent. The polls indicate 81%, the most recent one, people in the United States believe you should have medical marijuana available. The people in Indianapolis think that too. It's not a political risk for a politician to support a bill where 80% of the people in town would agree with this. Anyway, they rescheduled the trial a second time. The court called me again on Friday to make sure I was ready the second time. Now, in the meantime, I had gotten permission for Jeannie to testify in front of the jury from her hospital bed because she can't sit up. So we got there Monday, and they said, well, we got a jury this time, Steve, to choose from, but, you know, we don't have a room. There's no room in the city-county building. We can hold your trial with her in her hospital bed, but if you want to do the trial without your client, we could do this. I said, no way in hell. It took me so hard to get, a trial and get it scheduled and have her to testify from her bed. I wasn't going to do anything but that, but they continued the case again. I just happened to run into the prosecutor in the elevator. He congratulated me on some other case I'd won, but I said, you know, I didn't care about that. I really cared about what we were doing on this issue of medical marijuana in Indiana and what we were doing specifically about Jeannie Horton. What were they thinking about prosecuting her? What are we going to do about this? He said, well, she was having a party. I said, no, she was saving her life. And I made some other comment, and the elevator closed, and I'll be darned if they didn't dismiss the case. Now, I didn't really want the case dismissed except for my client. I wanted to make the law and precedent that, in fact, we should have a medical necessity case in Indiana, that there are valid statistics that show it would help people with MS. That's one of the main conditions it's been used for 9,000 years in recorded history. So I'm really glad and proud that you are thinking about this issue. It's kind of overdue. I helped draft one in the 70s when we had a governor named Bowen. He didn't think that it was a good idea. There's some interesting stories later about how he might have helped Beth with her chemotherapy treatments by giving marijuana, but I think that's a story, but I tend to believe it. But it's time we thought about it, and what I'd like to say is, you know, we could save $150 million a year not busting young people for little bits of pot in this state, and we can throw that $150 million a year to go after real crime like meth labs, which when I was here in April and they had the hearings, I heard 4 hours of people talking about drug things, and all they talked about was OxyContin, heroin, and meth labs, methamphetamine, precursors for meth. Why don't we take, and what I heard about marijuana from Tom Nolan was, God made marijuana. It can help me with my condition. Can't we at least study this to see if it'll help me and other Hoosiers so I don't have to break the law, so I can, if it's effective for me, can't we at least study it? And I sure hope we can. I think now is the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.